You are.
Hey friends, welcome to Sunday afternoon book discussion. I have drugged my hubby this time to talk about a book.
Hello.
He loves me so much. So we are actually talking about a book with love in the title, but it's not like about marriage. It's called Love Anyway by Jeremy Courtney. And so we both read this book over the last few. Well, actually, Matt read it, hard copy. I listened to it. And Jeremy actually narrated the book on Audible, so that was interesting. I always like it when an author narrates his own book. But anyway, so we're going to spend the next, few minutes talking about what we learned from the book. But first, I want to talk just a little bit about who Jeremy Courtney is and what the point of the book is. And Matt can correct me whenever I say any of these things wrong. Hey, welcome.
You're perfect.
Thanks. Thanks for doing this with me.
You're welcome.
So Jeremy Courtney is the author of the book. And I printed off these pictures. So there's a picture of Jeremy, and that's his lovely family. And his wife is Jessica, and their kids are Emma and Micah. And he's the author of the book, Love Anyway. And he is the founder and president of an organization called Preemptive Love. And it's a relief organization in Iraq and Syria. And Jeremy and Jessica went to Iraq after. It's very blurry.
It is. I think that perhaps
I messed it up by holding up the book.
Trying to do something. There we go. I don't know.
See, he's brilliant too. So Jeremy and Jessica went to Turkey first after post September 11th. With money from their church in order to be missionaries. That was like the whole reason that they went there in the first place. And at first they kind of went incognito. Is that the right way to say that? Like they sent them there, but they weren't supposed to tell people that they were there as missionaries.
A cover story.
Yes.
And they were living in many ways. They talk about in the book, he talks about how they were basically deceiving people about why they were there and who they were.
Yes.
And how they were able to live in Iraq without seemingly to have a job. They were supposed to be building a business of some kind.
Which always was like not really tangible or specific. So they were kind of there incognito at first, and then over some time, like the first 10 years, because the mission is kind of divided either like pre-ISIS and post-ISIS almost, if you will, is how I found it. And so the 10 years or so that they were there post 9/11 but before ISIS was really focused on medical care, providing medical care. That's what it became for children. There are lots of children. There were, probably still are, lots of children in Iraq born with birth defects, largely because of the toxic situation from the war and the agents used in chemicals and things. And so
warfare.
So they had all these children
aftermath
who were born with pretty horrific, some of the descriptions of them were really awful, birth defects. And so Preemptive Love, Jeremy's organization, was working to get them to the United States for surgery, but then also trying to...
Maybe not to the U.S., but to other countries.
Somewhere else. Yeah, good point.
Outside of Iraq.
Outside of Iraq for medical treatment. And then they then began to also try to educate people in Iraq to do more life-saving surgeries. And anyway, so that was kind of the first, not really first 10 years, but eventually, that's what it became in the first 10 years or so. And then in around 2014, the mission really changed as ISIS became like a force in Iraq. And ISIS, of course, was very violent and killing people, and millions of people had to flee. And many of the relief organizations that had gone into Iraq, like post 9/11, or maybe even before, I don't even know my history well enough probably, but most of those organizations were pulling out because of the threat of violence. And Jeremy and his organization and his family chose to stay. But then the organization kind of took a really different turn in that they were more like emergency aid, providing food and air,
basic care.
What's it?
Airdrops.
Yes, for food and necessary supplies. And they had some hard stories when they first started to do it about how it didn't work. Like they couldn't serve that many people, and the people would actually turn on each other trying to get the supplies and stuff. And he talks a lot about the failures.
They didn't really start this to become that type of an emergency aid organization.
Yes,
but they were the only people
kind of left.
Sort of the only people left,
and they had support still from donors, and so they were trying to do what they could with that support. And eventually, they were able to understand how to do that more effectively. And they also began to help refugees start small businesses because the goal always was to help people get back on their feet and live independently and promote peace. And that was always kind of what their goal is. So they have this pretty, I don't know that it's a massive organization, but it's massive in terms of like what the goals are, what they're trying to accomplish in Iraq. And he's still there. I think because this book is fairly recent, right? Do we know when this book was published? I didn't either. But Jeremy is a sought after speaker, and I'm just going to read this here. 2019. Yeah. And he's a sought after speaker. This was from his bio. He's been on CNN, Fox, ABC, NBC, PBS, CBS, Al Jazeera, the BBC, and also featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today. And he offers expert on-the-ground commentary on conflict in the Middle East.
If you Google him, you will find him.
True, Jeremy Courtney. Yeah, that's a good point. And his first book was called Preemptive Love, which is the name of his organization. And then this book is his second book called Love Anyway. And I showed you a picture of him and his family. And Matt watched a couple of TED Talks. I was going to let you talk about those just for a few minutes. I was going to let you. Isn't that nice of me?
It's nice. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Good to be here.
So Matt watched a couple of TED Talks. So what did you learn about him, just more about who he is from the TED Talks?
TED Talks were really focused. He did one. There's two online if you look on YouTube. One in Baghdad that he did where he spoke to the Iraqi people who were there, and one he did in Austin, Texas. And I don't know the audience for sure. They're obviously mostly American, but lessons to be learned from what he did in Iraq, and really focused on the need for people to trust each other, and how preemptive love is about showing to serve people, to love people in ways that maybe they wouldn't expect, just to help them in time of need. And by doing that, you can also build trust and relationships and cross boundaries that maybe you wouldn't otherwise be crossing. Internal to Iraq, it was about caring for these children who had 1 in 7. He uses these facts and figures in both talks about 1 in 7 children in Iraq have some type of birth defect.
1 in 7.
1 in 7 who are being born. He talks about the fact that some of the American soldiers who spent time there have similar issues with in their lives now too. And again, it's because of the warfare, agents and the warfare that might have been used. Cancer rates were higher in Iraq in these regions than they was in post World War II Japan. And the heart defects were among some of the most serious ailments for the children. And they started by a man approaching him one day asking, can you get my
that story was
can you
powerful.
get my child help and or my niece or this child help, whoever it was. And he kind of was,
I don't do
Jeremy's
that.
like, I don't do that.
I don't know anything about
that.
medicine.
But yet he did get into this, and
because I think that was a way to help them build trust.
Right.
Not manipulatively, but like
he talked about
just the vulnerability of needing help, and I can't get it, but you're an American.
You're an American.
He talked about just like, because I'm American, they think I'm like a superhero or something, like I can do everything because I'm American.
You have
and just
resources
how humbling that
somehow
was.
to help. And so he did help, and that started this whole path of medical care for children in Iraq, and getting them out of Iraq to other countries nearby that could help. They discovered was one path to do that, but even that led into issues of trust among the Iraqis and the people in the other country. But also it was expensive. It was $10,000 per child to get them outside of the country. And what they determined was if we could train the doctors and nurses in the hospitals in Iraq to do the work in the country, it was $700 a surgery. And so you can help so many more children. And he talked in the TED Talks, he uses the figure that there were 81 hospital in Iraq said they had 80 children a day that they turned away. And so you do the math, 365 days a year, you're talking almost 30,000 children who they had to say no to in a year, who just have these horrible medical conditions.
And the thing, many of them could be treated.
Yes,
if they had the resources.
Right. And earlier the better.
And
there are several examples in the TED Talk and and in the book about people they try to help that both successfully and unsuccessfully, just heartbreaking stories because these are children.
And that was kind of his work. Say hi to Julie. Julie's watching.
Hello, Julie.
Here's the book in case you want. Then I'll mess up the camera again probably. But yeah, so and that was kind of his work before the ISIS stuff, and then it just, I don't know. He didn't talk a lot about what happened with the medical stuff once ISIS came in, but the presence of ISIS was like, it was survival, right? Then it moved to like survival, and so many people were leaving, and so then they really turned to more of like an emergency aid kind of situation, because largely because like you said, they were the only ones, not the only ones probably, but it really seemed from the book that they were the primary,
a few remaining.
So I just pulled out a couple of things from the book that really spoke to me, and I kind of encouraged Matt to do the same. And so just a couple of themes that I thought were really important. And one of them was kind of early in the book. Jeremy talks about this. He's in this mosque, and he has this exchange with a Muslim man in the mosque, and they welcome him into the mosque. And Jeremy, when he went to Iraq, well, first in Turkey, but then in Iraq, I can't remember at what point this situation happened.
Turkey,
this was still in Turkey. And he really went kind of with, I would call it a chip on his shoulder, almost like, we Christians are good and you Muslims are bad, and we're right and you're wrong. And my job over here is to convince you to think like me, kind of. That was,
he talks about the missionary work they were sent on was sort of to go win people into Christianity, and you're right. And so go in there and just fight. And the more you fight, the more.
So he was always on attack, almost like assuming that he was surprised by this man's kindness. I remember from the story, and like through that experience, it did frustrate him, because he was just like, well, you're supposed to tell me I'm wrong so that I can convince you I'm right. Almost like he wasn't, this man wasn't inviting him into a debate. And somehow in that story, the Lord really got a hold of his heart in that, and humbled him. And he had just a real powerful spiritual experience where the Lord spoke to Jeremy, not audibly, but just in a way that he understood in his spirit, and said, you think you're here to make them think like you, but I have called you here to love them, like just to love them. And it like changed his whole idea about what it meant to be a missionary, or to be in mission. And it was really interesting, because it was either in the first chapter, really early in the book, maybe even in the intro, he says, and it really piqued my interest, because he says, I will offend everyone in this book. I will offend everyone in this book, either by who I was or who I have become. Like, and it's so, and this situation in the mosque was like a real turning point for him, where he began to understand that mission is not about convincing other people to see the world or life or whatever the way I do, but it's about loving people where they are. And so that was, I really appreciated that, him sharing that story and his heart change in that. But then another thing that really stuck out to me was when he began to communicate that heart change to his supporters back home, to the church who had commissioned him, and to some of the supporters that were providing funds for his work. He met resistance, because they were like, no,
criticism.
We sent you over there to make people think like you, and we want to see like numbers on a spreadsheet of how many converts and all, these kind of things, and I'm simplifying it, but that's what he was feeling from them. And his pastor from home, and it was really kind of like a faith crisis, I think, for Jeremy, in that his pastor from home, who had sent him, who had mentored him, and Jeremy kept saying things like, I've listened to his sermons and I think I'm trying to do what he's telling us to do, and yet he's asking me questions like, what kind of husband are you? What kind of father are you? What kind of leader are you? And it was interesting how it's like Jeremy's new attitude about how he would be in missions really created like some fear in the people who had sent him. And so then they began to attack him personally. And I was so not surprised, but I don't know, it just was significant to me. It felt so significant that then throughout the book, as he would relay different stories, he would ask himself those questions. Like when it got hard, he would say, he would think of those questions and say, what kind of husband am I? What kind of father am I? Like, I shouldn't have my kids here in this place where there's violence, or when my wife gets sad or something, like maybe I'm not, doing, or when somebody left, because as you can imagine, this organization, people came there to work and not everybody stayed, not everybody loved it, and so there were sometimes not really conflict, but there was hard things that happened even within the organization, and like, what kind of person am I if these are my choices?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, I think for me, some of the takeaway of the early part of the book, which he doesn't talk about in the TED Talk at all, he really just focuses on the work in Iraq with the medical care. But the book itself, he starts with this idea that, you know, he's following a calling from God about what he's supposed to do in his life, and his wife, and they agree to that, sort of, you know, with as anybody would, I think, with some trepidation about, well, what's it mean and what are we going to do? And here they are, really courageous and taking a risk to move overseas to the Middle East to be what they felt like they were called to do, to be missionaries. And then through the, I think it's a very powerful illustration of, through getting to know people and building relationships and learning more about the differences, but the similarities of people, it changed his perspective about what am I doing? And it kind of called the question on, am I here to do the right things, or am I here to do, is there something else I'm supposed to do here? And I think it's such a important reminder for all of us that sometimes you get a nudge or a calling to do something, and it's the one step you take that leads to a whole different path
that you could not have imagined when you took
you
the
wouldn't
one
have known.
step. Right.
Yeah, you couldn't have seen it. But so there's courage to go for him, and then there's courage to admit
let
change,
the story unfold,
and
to let God continue to lead.
And then there's a tremendous amount of courage to embrace the change, because, and then stay, because your life has been altered dramatically in terms of what you thought you were doing. You signed up for one thing. You have this transformation experience about what your calling is, and who you are, and how you want that to be presented from yourself,
and resistant people who
under some criticism from people,
basically your support team is
who sent you there and paid for you to
know.
come and be there, saying, well, wait a minute, that's not what we sent you there for. Well, but I feel so strongly about it, I'm gonna risk all those relationships and do what I think I'm supposed to do. And then the impact that you see he's had on tens of thousands of people, millions of people in Iraq, and what it's led to.
I'm teaching in Galatians right now, so everything reminds me of Galatians. But it's like when Paul says, you know, do I work to please men, or do I work to please God? You know, and that's what, you know, I think that at some point that's the question that we all have to answer for ourselves. Something else that I thought was really interesting in the book was, so he raises this question that what if we could be about preemptive love, which is the name of his organization. What if we could be about preemptive? And he talks about just this idea of not needing anything from people. It's kind of like a radical idea, except it's like a Jesus idea. So it's not like it's unfamiliar to us. Those are us that are Jesus followers. But what if we could be about preemptive love, radical preemptive love, not needing something from someone else in order to decide if you're worthy of love? And it's such a simple question. We were talking about this earlier, but it's such a simple question, but so challenging. And he began to see what that looked like with his Iraqi people, not his Iraqi people, but with the Iraqi people around him. And then the question was called in his life when he went back home for these, like for the supporters and the people from the church that had sent him and all that. And that was almost even a harder question for him, where it's like, I'm doing this in the mission field where I am, but now that I'm going home to face the people, can I love them the same way, even though I think it's almost like it's a different kind of violence and warfare almost, you know, it's not violence physically the way it is, but emotionally this has really stirred up some things that are really difficult. And it reminded me so much of God's prevenient grace for us, in that God's grace is always there. It's always present. It doesn't depend on us. The grace is it's just there in abundance all the time. And as we try to be more like Jesus, shouldn't we be emulating that idea that our grace and love for other people is always there? But dang, that's tough.
Easier to say, than to do. But it's the example that Christ gave us, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then if you can, as he calls preemptive love, I mean, it's a tagline, right? In many ways, it's the name of his organization. But it's a concept that we've heard from any number of leaders and people in the world about the importance of loving one another.
And it's what changes
and it's
things.
what in his case, absolutely.
You had a Martin Luther King quote.
Yeah, love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend.
Yeah.
Uh,
and yet
we have to be reminded of that through things like this time and time again. And this is maybe one of the more dramatic illustrations of how to
example, sort of.
Of how it comes into play in somebody's life.
But it's applicable for all of us.
It could be at your school, work, neighborhood, city, family, maybe.
Julie's quote. I love that story too, Julie, where she says that the scripture is perhaps you were made for such a time as this. And Esther, where Esther has this huge dilemma of, do I risk myself for the better of my people? Yeah. And her answer is yes, and I see that with Jeremy. And it's one thing, and this is the thing that's always hard, and I'm sure, like, as a man and husband and father, you say, like, it's one thing for you to say, this is what I'm going to do with my life. Right. But he's saying, this is what we're going to, I mean, and he's very much like, I mean, they're a team. They're deciding together, but but it's his family, and there's
a casual nature too in the book, and I'm sure it wasn't that casual of, well, I'm going to go here and leave my wife in Iraq in the middle of all these problems going on, and I'm going to fly back to the United States, and she'll stay here with the kids. And I mean, things that I don't think most of us could imagine even contemplating a trip to Iraq for any reason, or any war zone or any
don't
place
take me to Iraq and leave me there.
And then to say, then I'll leave and I'll come back.
Because he had to do like some touring and stuff for his book and different things.
And then the stories of where he went and some of the cities and some of the areas he ended up in the middle of all of this fighting in Iraq. And, you have family in country with you, with your children, and
he talked about losing people that were close to him, losing friends and journalists that were close
any
to
of us,
him.
most of us, kind of life we live
will ever experience,
and different even, I would say, than the soldier being there, because you're not moving there with your family and your children in tow.
And he wasn't a soldier,
and so he wasn't
for that.
at all.
He wasn't trained for that.
And so.
And sometimes he butted heads with the soldiers,
because he
because he would be trying to go in and do things, and they were like, "Man,
are you crazy?
Don't go in there," whatever. So,
and so there's a whole element of this about how also, that Jessica, his wife's perspective, is somewhat missing in this, just because it's his book and his story, and while she's in it through his eyes. You have a whole different perspective. I wonder about
continues to talk about her growing ministry throughout the book.
Right.
And towards the end of the book, he said something that meant a lot to me, where he was talking about how big a part of this that she was. And at one point he said something about her skills, and he said something like, I haven't always acknowledged those, but I see now how like fantastic a support and in her own right, doing her own ministry with the people there. And because she's one of the ones that, if you get on the Preemptive Love website, you can buy some things. And one of the things, like, to support, one of the things is refugee soap. Because she began, these people used to make soap, and then they kind of got away from that or something. And then Jessica learned how to make soap again, and then taught some of the ladies how to make soap. And then they bought the first like batches. And so they were trying to do, what's that called? Like a micro loan or something, like, right? Is that, like, it seemed like it was kind of like that, where they were like, we will buy these first batches and try to help you get going. And that changed communities when they were able to make their own money. And other women saw some women making money, and then, and it grew. And anyway, so one of the things that you can buy on their website is, so I think she is a bigger part of the story than like was in this book. I'm confident that's true. So, and then the last thing for me that I just wanted to point out that I thought was just really good was, it's way at the end of the book, way at the end of the book, and it's in the acknowledgments. And Jeremy asks the key question: can we accept that the world is violent and scary as hell and decide to love anyway? And I thought about that with his circumstance, because his world has been and is violent and scary as hell. But I also, I can pick that up from what he's asking and lay it down in my own heart, because emotionally, sometimes the world feels like that, where you're just like, I just don't know if I want to be all in this today, or if I want to risk the hurt or the loss of limb, almost emotionally, that comes with sometimes loving that way. And it is a decision. It's not a feeling. I think we think sometimes that it doesn't, I don't feel very loving towards, whatever, but we decide whether or not we're going to follow, Jesus's greatest commandment is love God, love others, love self. And that's a decision for us. And it was a good reminder of that. And like I said, just a very sort of extreme example of how someone is using their life. Not perfectly. He's very honest about the ways that it's been hard. But I think that's all the more credit to him for saying, sometimes you just stick with it.
Right.
You just keep trying. You get up and try again. Yeah. So.
Well, I think the only other takeaway I'll share on the book is, so many of us, we know about the war in Iraq or the Middle East tensions and things because of some news. I mean, we know the basics of following the news and that type of thing.
I'm going to interrupt you. He even talked about being on the news sometimes,
right,
and feeling like he was drugged into something that he was like, it's not like that over here. It's not like what it is at all. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
And if you want a perspective of what, in some ways, maybe it's a terminology to call him a common man, but
like layman's terms.
Layman's term.
Yeah.
A man who's in Iraq doing at times of great warfare and complete unknowns of, am I going to live through situations?
Huge personal
and
risk.
Watching firsthand stories that he can tell about what it really was like there for himself, but also for so many of the Iraqis who were scared to death of the things happening in their country and by their fellow countrymen in many cases. And the grief of losing things and being displaced. Right.
And, I mean, we're all just people.
Right.
I've thought about that in the part where he was writing when they were all removed from their hometown and they had to resettle somewhere else, and they went back with those virtual reality glasses or whatever, and they took pictures of what their hometown looked like, and then they were able to show that to them, and the grief that they experienced because the town was gone. It had been leveled, bombed, and they had left an emergency situation. And I just think about that, like, if we had to leave, if we just had to leave with basically anything we could grab and the clothes on our back, and we could never come back, and then somebody brought us pictures of our neighborhood, and
and we were
that's
leaving,
not even our neighborhood.
We were leaving in the midst of great fear,
and not everybody got out,
and not everybody made it out, and just down the street are these bad people coming to kill us, and just get what you can and leave. And hopefully you can get out fast enough, but you couldn't always make the decision of not everybody could go with you. And so you left some people behind because you couldn't.
There
wasn't time. They were too slow. Horrific stories to even think about. But if you want to learn more about some of the stories about what it was like in Iraq during a war like they've been through, this book provides that kind of, and I didn't expect that.
I didn't either. So, I learned a lot. I think I learned a lot from it. So it's good, and it's hard at times, but and here he is again. I'll put his picture up there. There's Jeremy, and there's his beautiful family. I think Matt thought the kids were. This is probably a little bit older because the kids, the kids were born while they were over there. But so anyway, so thank you for doing this with me. Yay, this was fun. We'll have to get it back on and do something else. But here, I'm going to tell you what's coming up next, and then we're going to get off here because we've been on here for a while. So in February, towards the end of the month, I can't remember. I think it's like the 25th or something. Lisa and Maria will be back. My pretty friends will be here. No, I'm just kidding. And we're going to be we're back to fiction, and it's called We Hope for Better Things by Erin Bartels. And I'm about 100 pages in or so, and I'm loving it. It's really good. It's kind of like so it's about this woman in current time, and then it's her aunt in like maybe the 60s or something.
I have no idea.
And then it's like, anyways, guys, it's good. And that's our February read. And then our March read, I'll go ahead and do a little promo. My new friend, Cassia Elder, has written this book called Make Me a Blessing. I met her through a writer's conference, and I'm so excited because Cassia is going to be on in March to do an author interview with us. And so I'm looking forward to that already. And she's doing an online Bible study of this book right now, actually on her page. Cassia Elder is her name, and she's a delight. So I'm looking forward to getting to know her better and reading her work and introducing you all to her. So thanks, Julie. I see your comment still. And thanks for anybody else who might have been watching. And thank you very much for doing this with me. I really appreciate it. So see you guys. Have a good rest of your day.